Three men stood in a room at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Before them lay a mission that seemed impossible. Behind them stood everyone they loved, and beneath them, in flooded darkness, waited a choice between certain death and possible salvation. This is the story of Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. Three men who walked into radioactive water to save millions. Three men who became legends. Three men who, against all odds, survived to tell their story. Close your eyes. Let us remember the divers who weren't divers, the heroes who said they were just doing their job, the men who refused to let fear stop them from doing what had to be done. It was May 1st, 1986. 5 days had passed since the explosion at Reactor 4. 5 days of chaos and confusion and growing dread. The firefighters had extinguished the flames. The evacuations were complete. Pripyat stood empty. But the crisis was not over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. The reactor core was still melting. 185 tons of uranium and graphite, heated to temperatures that turned solid metal into liquid. The corium, they called it. A flowing mass of radioactive lava that was burning through the concrete floors of the reactor building, seeking the path downward, following gravity's pull toward the earth below. And beneath the reactor in the basement levels lay 5 million gallons of water, the bubbler pools, massive tanks designed to condense steam and provide cooling for the plant. The firefighters, in their desperate battle against the flames, had pumped even more water into the building. The basement was flooded, and the molten core was descending toward it. The physicists did the calculations. They ran the numbers again and again, hopping for a different result. But the answer was always the same. If the corium reached the water, the result would be catastrophic. A thermal explosion, a steam blast of unimaginable force. The remaining reactors would be destroyed. The entire power plant complex would be leveled, and hundreds of tons of radioactive material would be thrown into the atmosphere. The fallout would contaminate groundwater across Ukraine, the Pripyat River, the Dnieper that fed Kiev and flowed south to the Black Sea. Millions of people depended on that water. Millions more lived in the path of the radioactive cloud that would spread across Europe. The disaster that had already occurred would seem minor by comparison. The water had to be drained. The bubbler pools had to be emptied before the corium reached them. But how? The valves that controlled the drainage system were located in the flooded basement, 3 meters underwater, in darkness, in radiation levels that would kill any man who entered. The plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin called a meeting. They explained the situation to the senior staff. Someone had to go into the basement. Someone had to find the valves. Someone had to open them manually. The electronic controls were destroyed. Remote operation was impossible. It had to be done by hand. They asked for volunteers. The room fell silent. Every man there understood what was being asked. This was not a rescue mission. This was not cleanup work. This was a death sentence, or so it seemed. Alexei Ananenko was the first to step forward. He was a mechanical engineer, 26 years old. He knew the plant's layout better than almost anyone. He had worked on the cooling systems. He knew where the valves were located. If anyone could find them in the flooded darkness, it was him. Valery Bespalov was next, a senior engineer, experienced, calm under pressure. If the valves were stuck, if they needed to be forced open, Bespalov had the technical knowledge to make it happen. And then Boris Baranov volunteered, the shift supervisor, 45 years old, a leader, a man who would not ask others to face danger he would not face himself. 3 men, 3 volunteers, the suicide squad people would later call them, but they did not think of themselves that way. They were engineers. They had a problem to solve, and they were the only ones who could solve it. The officials told them their families would be taken care of. They promised medals, honors, compensation. The men nodded, but these were not the reasons they volunteered. They volunteered because someone had to, Because if they did not, millions would die. Because this was their plant, their responsibility, their moment. They were given wetsuits, not diving suits with air supplies, just simple wetsuits like surfers wear. They were given waterproof flashlights, dosimeters to measure radiation exposure, and a large adjustable spanner because Anane & Co. worried the valves might be stuck after days underwater. On May 4th, they descended into the basement. The water was dark, contaminated, radioactive. The dosimeters clicked faster and faster as they waded deeper. The water rose to their knees, then their waists. The flashlight beams cut through the murky darkness, searching for landmarks, for pipes, for anything recognizable. Anane & Co. led the way. This was his domain. He had walked these corridors hundreds of times in the light in safety. Now he navigated by memory and instinct. Bespalov and Baranov followed close behind. They could not afford to get separated. In the flooded darkness alone, a man would be lost forever. The radiation was intense. The water itself was contaminated, but they pressed forward. Minutes passed like hours. The search continued. And then Anane & Co.'s flashlight beam found it. A pipe. The pipe. The one that led to the drainage valves. They waded toward it. The valve wheels emerged from the black water. Anane & Co. tried the first one. It turned, stiff but functional. Bespalov worked on the second. The spanner proved unnecessary. The valves had not seized. They cranked the wheels once, twice, 3 times, open. They heard it then, the rush of water, the sound of 5 million gallons beginning to drain. The mission was complete. They turned back, retracing their path through the flooded corridors, up the stairs, back to the light, back to the living. When they emerged from the basement, their colleagues embraced them, cheered them, celebrated them. The impossible had been done. The valves were open. The bubbler pools were draining. By the next morning, the tanks were empty. The threat was neutralized. Europe was saved. But what of the men themselves? The legend that grew around them said they died, that they sacrificed their lives, that they succumbed to acute radiation syndrome within weeks, their bodies destroyed by the lethal doses they absorbed in the radioactive water. It is a powerful story, a tragic story, the kind of story that makes heroes into martyrs, but it is not true. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov survived. They all survived. In the days and weeks following their mission, all 3 men showed signs of radiation sickness. Ananenko developed what he later called a radioactive tan, black spots on his legs where the radiation had penetrated most deeply. They set off radiation alarms even after repeated showers, even after scrubbing themselves clean. The wetsuits had provided little protection. They were hospitalized, treated, monitored. They took iodine pills, they underwent tests, and slowly they recovered. The doses they received, while significant, were not immediately lethal. The water itself had provided some shielding. The speed of their mission had limited exposure, and perhaps, just perhaps, they were lucky. Anane & Co. returned to work at Chernobyl. For 3 more years, he served as a liquidator, part of the vast army of workers who decontaminated the zone. He wore protective suits. He took precautions. He continued to work in the nuclear industry until 2017, when a serious car accident forced his retirement. He lived. He survived. Bespalov also survived. He went on to work for Energo-Atom, Ukraine's state nuclear power company. He made a life. He had a future. The mission that should have killed him did not. Boris Baranov lived 19 more years. He worked. He aged. He was 64 years old when he died in 2005. Not from radiation, not from cancer, from a heart attack. A death that might have come to any man his age. An ordinary death after an extraordinary life. For decades, the truth about the 3 men was obscured. The Soviet government, which controlled information, which classified documents, which prioritized secrecy over accuracy, allowed the legend to grow. The heroic sacrifice, the noble death, it made a better story than the truth. But the truth is better than any legend. Because the truth is that three men faced certain death and lived. They did what had to be done, knowing the cost, accepting the risk, and they walked away. They survived. They grew old. They saw their children grow. They watched the world change. In 2018, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko presented Ananenko and Bespalov with the Order for Courage. Baranov received his posthumously. The ceremony was held at Chernobyl, with the new safe confinement structure visible in the background. Finally, recognition. Finally, acknowledgement of what they had done. In 2019, all three were awarded the title Hero of Ukraine, the nation's highest honor, given to those who have made exceptional contributions to the country. It came 33 years late, but it came. Ananenko has spoken about the mission in interviews. He is modest, humble. He says he was just doing his job, that he never thought it might mean death, that they sent him because he knew how to do it, because he was a maintenance engineer, because that was his role. He says he could hardly have said no. Why would you employ someone like that, someone who would refuse when needed? This is the perspective of a man who does not see himself as a hero, who sees himself as a professional who did what his profession required. But history sees him differently. History sees all three men differently. They were not suicide volunteers. They were not martyrs. They were engineers who assessed a problem, calculated the risks, and executed a solution. They were men who chose action over paralysis, duty over safety, the lives of millions over their own comfort. The HBO series Chernobyl dramatized their story. In the show, officials make a stirring speech calling for volunteers. They speak of duty and sacrifice and the millions who will die if the mission fails. It makes for compelling television. But Ananenko has said the reality was more pragmatic. They did not need speeches. They did not need motivation. They simply needed to know what had to be done, and then they did it. This perhaps is the truest heroism, not grand gestures and dramatic speeches, but quiet competence in the face of danger, professional skill applied to an impossible problem, courage that does not announce itself but simply acts. The men who cleared the roof of Reactor 3, the biorobots who worked in 90-second shifts, received more attention. The firefighters who died in the immediate aftermath became symbols of sacrifice. The miners who dug the tunnel beneath the reactor were celebrated. All deserved recognition. All were heroes. But Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov prevented a second explosion that would have dwarfed everything else. They saved Kiev. They saved the Dnieper. They saved the Black Sea. They saved parts of Eastern Europe from contamination that would have lasted centuries. And they did it in darkness, wading through radioactive water, with nothing but flashlights and determination, and the knowledge that someone had to open those valves. Someone had to turn those wheels. Someone had to drain that water. When Ananenko's flashlight found the pipe, when he saw it emerging from the black water, he felt joy. Not relief, not fear, joy, because the pipe meant they could complete the mission. It meant they could do what they came to do. When they heard the rush of water draining, when they knew the valves were open and the pools were emptying, they felt satisfaction. A job done correctly. A problem solved. The kind of satisfaction that comes from professional competence, from doing difficult work well. These were not men who sought glory. They were not men who chased recognition. They were engineers who loved their work, who took pride in their knowledge, who believed in the importance of nuclear power done correctly and safely. The disaster at Chernobyl was caused by shortcuts, by ignored warnings, by decisions made for political rather than technical reasons. But the response to the disaster, the cleanup, the containment, that was done by men who understood that sometimes you must do dangerous things because the alternative is worse. Men like Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov. Tonight, we remember them not as martyrs but as survivors, as men who faced the worst imaginable circumstances and emerged alive, as engineers who solved an impossible problem with courage and skill and determination. We remember that heroism is not always about sacrifice. Sometimes it is about doing what needs to be done and then living to tell about it, about walking into danger and walking back out, about facing death and choosing life. Alexei Ananenko is 74 years old now. He lives in Ukraine. He receives a modest pension. He has his memories. He has his stories. He has survived not just Chernobyl but the decades since, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the wars, the changes, all the upheavals of history. Valery Bespalov also lives. He too has grown old. He too carries memories of that day in the flooded basement, the darkness, the water, the clicking of the dosimeters, the moment when the flashlight beam found the pipe, the sound of water rushing, the relief, the joy. Boris Baranov is gone, but he lived 19 years after the mission. 19 years of life he might not have had. 19 years with family and friends. 19 years of ordinary days after one extraordinary night. The bubbler pools beneath Reactor 4 stand empty now. The sarcophagus has been sealed. The new safe confinement provides another layer of protection. The reactor will be dismantled eventually, piece by piece, over decades. And when that work is done, when the site is finally safe, it will be in part because 3 men waded through radioactive water in 1986 and turned 2 valves in the darkness. Let us rest now, here in gratitude for those who do impossible things, for those who walk toward danger when others walk away, for those who save millions and call it just doing their job. Sleep well.